In this video, we're going to take a look at apportionment. Our objective is to learn the difference between the two bodies of Congress, to learn what apportionment is, and to learn how apportionment works in the U.S. House of Representatives. So I want to start off with a little background on the U.S. government to make sure we're all on the same page, to really make sure we're comfortable with talking about what the U.S. government is and how it works. There are three bodies, or three branches of the U.S. government. We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The executive branch is the president and the president's cabinet. The legislative branch is what we refer to as Congress, and then the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, the court system. Not just the Supreme Court, they're part of it, but the court system. The legislative branch is the part that we're kind of focusing on today. Legislative branch is Congress. Congress is both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. This is one of my pet peeves. I hear this said wrong all the time on the news. Newscasters will refer to Congress and just be referring to one or the other, and that's not the case. If you're saying Congress, it is both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate at once. Congress is both bodies together. If we want to discuss one or the other, we will have to name them by name. So the U.S. House of Representatives, or the U.S. Senate. And with apportionment today, we're really going to focus on the U.S. House, but I just want to point out some of the key differences between them from both the election standpoint in terms of what they do. So the legislative branch is in charge of creating the laws, writing those, and then sending them on to the president to sign. They are also in charge of, in some cases, appointing or approving of appointments. So a lot of judges, all judges, federal judges have to be approved by the Senate. Cabinet positions have to be approved by the Senate. There are certain other responsibilities that fall to the House and the Senate that aren't always the same. So a lot of times I think we just think, oh, they make laws, they do the same thing all the time. And they do on the law front. If they're making laws, they both have to sign off on the law. The president has to sign off on the law. But there are some differences between the two bodies. For instance, the first is that the U.S. House of Representatives only serve 2-year terms. When they're elected, they are only going to go to Washington for 2 years before they have to win another election. Senators get to go for 6 years before they have to run again. U.S. House of Representatives, they are solely responsible for budget issues. They write the budget and they are the ones that vote on it. The Senate, they have the sole responsibility of approving cabinet positions, judges, and ambassadors. Now you might say, well, I've heard about both of the opposite ones arguing about certain things. Well, they have their ways of kind of like interfering or trying to get involved in the opposite responsibilities. For instance, the U.S. Senate, a lot of times they might not be writing the budget, but they're approving of programs that the budget funds. Or the House of Representatives might pass some sort of resolution that they approve or disapprove of a certain person, but they might not necessarily be voting on it. So they like to make themselves heard, even though they're not necessarily directly responsible for those aspects. Other responsibilities, the U.S. House of Representatives is the group to actually impeach the President of the United States. Impeaching the President does not mean removing. They're the ones that bring charges, essentially. They're like the prosecuting attorneys. They bring the charges against the President, and then the President would be tried and potentially removed by the U.S. Senate. I bring this one up because it has happened relatively recently. President Trump was impeached twice by the U.S. House of Representatives, and both times the U.S. Senate acquitted the president, did not remove the president in that impeachment proceeding. Bill Clinton was also impeached. President Clinton, back in 1998-99, was not removed, and there have been a couple other cases where presidents have been impeached but not removed. Both chambers do vote on laws. The membership looks a little different. The U.S. House of Representatives has a total of 435 members. The Senate, there are only 100 senators. And the House of Representatives was created in a way to represent the people. Because some states are bigger than others, the thought was, well, they should have more representation than other states. For instance, California, our largest state by population, has more representatives than any other state in Congress. The Senate side, though, every state only gets 2 senators. And the idea there was, well, if we're a small state, we shouldn't get bullied around by the big states. So we want to have equal representation. So there's both of these chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, that are acting in 2 different functions. The House is really there to represent the people, based on the number of people in the state, the population of the state, and the Senate is there to kind of allow the states to be weighted a little bit more equally regardless of population size. There are discussions on which one is better. I'm going to leave that up to you, but that's how the Congress is broken up. So the Senate is pretty straightforward. We just have 2 from each state. Easy, done. The House, though, well, we got to figure out how are we breaking up this 435. We have 435, but California's the biggest. Do we give them 30 or do we give them 10? Do we give Wyoming very small? Do we give them only 1 or should they get a couple too, right? So we got to figure out how to break this up. So apportionment is this process of breaking up the members of the House of Representatives, giving them to each state. So we're going to need to note 2 things very early on, the Standard Divisor and the Standard Quotient. The Standard Divisor is the total population divided by the number of seats or representatives. It doesn't have to necessarily be the U.S. House. Other states have the same issue, or other countries, I should say, have the same issue of having to divide up membership. The Standard Quota is the population of the state divided by the Standard Divisor. So let's take an example. Here we have 3 provinces, province 1, 2, and 3. We want to divide up 20 representatives across these 3 provinces. We're going to find the Standard Divisor and then figure out the Standard Quota for each state. So let me start by finding the Standard Divisor. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the entire population. We're going to assume this made-up country has 3 provinces, not states, provinces. We're going to find their total population, and we're going to divide that up into those 20 representatives. So our population would be 20,000 plus 35,000 plus 5,000. And there are a total of 20 different representatives. And so if we add up 20,000, 35,000, and 5,000, that gives us a total of 60,000. And when we divide that by 20, we get 3,000. So what the Standard Divisor gives us is the number of people represented by a single representative, by 1 rep. So in this make-believe country, 3,000 people are going to be represented by single 1 representative. Now we want to figure out how many representatives each province gets. So we're going to take province 1. And they had, remember, 20,000 people. I'm going to divide it by the 3,000 people per representative. So if we take 20,000 divided by 3,000, we get 6.67. This would be province 1's standard quota. Let me make this look a little bit nicer. Province 1, and these are the standard quotas. Now you might be looking at that saying, well, 6.67, what does that mean? How many representatives are they going to get? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second. Let's do them all first. Province 2. Province 2, remember, was the largest. It had 35,000 people. I'm going to divide them up into 3,000s as well. And when we do that, we get a total of 11.67. Same problem as before, we've gotten a fraction. And then province 3, well, they were the small one. They were only 5,000 people. We're going to divide them by 3,000 as well. And we get 1.67 as the standard quota. So all 3 of these numbers would be our standard quotas. What do we do with these, right? How do we handle these? In terms of just getting to a standard quota, we're done, we have it. But here's the challenge, right? We look at all 3 of these numbers and say, well, we should probably round all of those numbers up. So here we'd round this up to a 7, this would round up to a 12, and this would round up to a 2. Let's do the math. 7 plus 12 plus 2 is 21. How many representatives were we allowed to have? Only 20. And you might say, well, why don't we just increase that number of representatives? Well, the U.S. Constitution says 435 is the most they can have. And maybe that shouldn't be such a hard, fast rule. Maybe it should be between 400 and 450, whatever it would take, right? However the rounding rules would dictate. But that is a system that we currently have where it's set at a set top number. And this 21 just wouldn't be allowed. And so now we've got to say to these three provinces, okay, some of you only get the minimum standard quota. The minimum standard quota would be 6, 11, and 1. It's essentially the whole number. And you have to have at least 1. But then, if we add those up, it's 17, 18. We have 18 representatives. We still need 2 more. So now we got to decide, okay, where are these 2 going to go? Do we give 2 to the bigger states? But that doesn't seem fair because Province 3 had the exact same fraction as the other 2. And so that's where it's a little bit more challenging. And I'm going to kind of leave that question for a few more minutes. We're going to do a couple more examples finding standard quotas. So let's bring this back to the US. I'm going to do 3 examples, and we're going to look at 3 states in the US. The US has a total population of 330 million. North Carolina has a population of 10.5 million. We want to figure out how many North Carolina should get, how many representatives North Carolina should have. So I'm going to look at the standard quota first. Standard quota, just abbreviating standard. So we take the 330 million and divide it by the number of representatives, 435. And so when we do that, we get 758,621. I'm going to just call it 620. So that is the standard quota. That is how many people each representative in the U.S. Congress should represent. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take North Carolina's population. Sorry, this was not the standard quota. This was the Standard Divisor. I want to find the standard quota. And so we're going to take the population of North Carolina, 10,500,000, divide it by the 758,620. And when we divide, we get a total of 13.84. And so this would be our answer. This is our standard quota. Just to let you all know, North Carolina does have a total of 14 representatives. So that one kind of makes sense. Let's keep that in the back of our minds as we go forward. We already know the standard divisor. That's going to stay the same. The U.S. population is the same throughout the entire country. Same number of representatives, 435. But our standard quota for New York is going to be different. New York has a population of 20 million. So I'm going to take 20 million and divide it by 758,620. And they get 26.36. And if I'm going to do a quick little Google search here, New York representatives. And we'll see. New York has a total of 27 representatives. As of when I made this video, of course, it changes in every 10 years when the U.S. goes through a U.S. census. Then they reapportion, meaning they have to redo all of these numbers. The standard divisor changes because we have more people. The state sizes changes, so it varies. So North Carolina kind of makes sense. That one rounded up, but New York's actually rounded up too, even though we would have kind of predicted it should have rounded down. And then if we look at Wyoming, they have a total of 600,000 people. So notice they don't even qualify for a whole representative. When I do that division, that is 0.79 is the standard quota there. And again, I'll let you know that they do get one representative. And so it seems a little bit arbitrary. Again, in green are the actual numbers. And I'll tell you what makes this even stranger is if we went through and did every single state, sometimes they don't even round up correctly. So sometimes a 14.7 might round down to a 14. And so how does that actually work in practice? We now understand how the standard divisor works, how the standard quota works, but how do those rounding rules work? And that is not an easy answer, and that's not something we're going to work through in this video. That's not something I'm going to really teach you about today. That'd be a higher level class, a higher level politics class. The initial process is exactly what we just did. To calculate each state's apportionment, or what they're going to get in representatives, after the U.S. Census, the country calculates a standard divisor, and it calculates a standard quota. From there, it gives everyone a minimum quota. And so that would be the 1326 1, because you have to have at least one. And then from there, they have used these other methods to figure out, okay, how much does the state get, right? Does it round up? Does it round down? So one of the first methods that was proposed was the Hamilton method. That was actually not used in the United States. So Hamilton proposed this, finding the standard quota and giving everybody its minimum, rounding down, regardless, always rounds down, and then just comparing those fractional remainders and saying, okay, well, if we only have these three states, then the North Carolina would get one because they have the highest remainder, and just continuing to divvy out seats in that way. Thomas Jefferson always had to disagree with Hamilton, if you look back in history. So he came up with his own method, and the Jefferson method was used for a number of years early on. And one of the things that they found, though, was that sometimes under Hamilton's method, there was this thing called the Alabama paradox, where actually increasing the number of seats reduced a state's number of seats. So let me take a step back. I told you that there's 435 representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives, and that was fixed in the Constitution. That was not true early days. Early days, that number was allowed to move. And under Hamilton's method, sometimes when they upped that number of seats, it would actually cause a state like North Carolina to go from, say 14 down to 13, because those remainders would change. Just kind of a weird thing, paradox, something that seems like it shouldn't happen, but it does. And so this Alabama paradox, what happened in Alabama is that by increasing the number of seats, some states actually lost out. And so that was one of the things that some of the later methods tried to fight. There was another paradox too that popped up, a population paradox, which sometimes faster growing states wouldn't gain seats as quickly as the slower growing states, just because, again, those remainders, North Carolina, higher remainder, even though it might be growing slower, then Wyoming may have gotten the seat first. So that happened at times. So Jefferson implemented a new method, still based on that standard quota and the minimum quota, and then using rounding rules would determine if there are too many seats or not enough seats, and would use a modified divisor. Now, modified divisor, remember we came up with a standard divisor, this number up here. Question is, well, how do you modify that divisor? And it's a little bit kind of just like playing with it and massaging it to figure out, okay, are we over or are we under? And so not quite as clear cut. That was used from 1792 to 1830. And then they actually did switch to Hamilton's method for a little bit. Webster was the next method that was implemented, and that was from 1900 to 1940. That was similar to Jefferson's method, but it used a modified divisor in a slightly different way. And so again, I'm not going to go into detail on how these modified divisors were calculated, but just a slight variation on Jefferson's method. And then finally, the most recent method we've been using since 1940 is that Hill-Huntington method, or the Huntington-Hill method. The names get reversed depending on the site. That was similar to Webster's. It still used that modified divisor, but it used it based on a geometric mean. So it used rounding rules based on a geometric mean. And so that, again, is why sometimes those remainders will round in weird ways. Some things that we would think round down, round up. And sometimes things that round up would actually round down. There are some constitutional requirements for these representatives, per the Constitution, one vote, each person should have one vote, one person, right? And there's some other requirements as far as the apportionment is considered. And some of these later methods, the Hill-Huntington method, the Webster method, were really meant to address those constitutional requirements, keep us from breaking the Constitution. The Webster and Hill-Hunting method have not broken the constitutional requirements, but they could. And so, the question will be, well, what happens when they're broken? Will we see a new method? Will we have to slightly adjust that? That is all to be determined.